The wagon creaked over the dry earth, its wheels crunching against gravel and dust. Inside, 19-year-old Clara sat stiffly beside her father, hands clenched tightly in her lap. The road ahead wound through miles of barren prairie, each mile taking her farther from the only home she had ever known. Her father said little, his jaw set, his eyes hollow. He'd done what he thought was necessary, marrying her off to a poor farmer named Samuel Hayes, a man twice her age. A man she'd never met. Clara knew better than to protest. Her father's debts had been piling for months. The landlord had already threatened to seize the little they had left. "He's a good man," her father had told her that morning, avoiding her gaze. "Hardworking. You'll be fed, kept warm? That's more than most girls get." The words were meant to comfort, but they fell like stones in her heart. The sky burned orange as they reached Samuel's land. The farm looked smaller than Clara imagined. A sagging cabin of weathered pine, a half-collapsed barn, and fields so dry they might never yield again. A single man stood waiting near the porch, his frame tall but lean, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "This him?" her father asked. Samuel nodded once, silent. His voice came low, steady. "You're Clara." She swallowed hard and nodded. Her father handed him a small leather pouch, payment or perhaps dowry, she couldn't tell. The sound of coins clinking made her stomach twist. She had been sold like a cow at market. Her father turned to her then, guilt flickering in his eyes. "Be a good wife, Clara." He hesitated, then climbed back into the wagon. The wheels turned, the sound fading until only the wind and Samuel's quiet breathing remained. Clara stood in the dirt, the weight of her new life pressing down. She expected commands or coldness, maybe even a rough hand dragging her inside. But Samuel merely said, "You must be tired. Come in." The inside of the cabin was sparse. 2 chairs, a wood stove, a rough-hewn table, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. Samuel moved with deliberate calm, avoiding her gaze. "There's stew on the stove. Eat if you're hungry." Clara nodded, unsure if she should speak. The stew smelled faintly of herbs and smoke, and though her stomach growled, she couldn't bring herself to eat much. She watched Samuel from the corner of her eye as he removed his hat and coat. His hair was streaked with gray, though he couldn't have been more than 35. His hands, broad, calloused, spoke of years of labor. When darkness fell, Clara stood awkwardly by the bed. She'd heard tales from village girls of what husbands expected on wedding nights. Her heart thudded painfully as Samuel took a blanket and laid it on the floor. "You take the bed," he said simply. She stared at him, startled. "But it's yours," he shook his head. "You're the one who's traveled all day. Rest." He lay down without another word, turning his back. The room filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Clara lay on the bed, unable to sleep. Every creak of the cabin seemed to echo her confusion. Why had he been so distant, so gentle? Men who bought wives were not known for restraint. She watched the faint light flicker across his shoulders and wondered what kind of man Samuel Hayes really was. Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the dry grass. Inside, 2 strangers, bound by circumstance, lay in the fragile silence of their first night together. Clara's fear slowly gave way to a new emotion she couldn't name, something between confusion, curiosity, and the faint, impossible spark of hope. She did not yet know that this quiet, weary man would one day change everything she believed about love, kindness, and herself. The morning sun crept weakly through the cracks of the cabin walls, spilling pale light across the wooden floor. Clara awoke to the sound of movement, the scrape of boots, the creak of the door, the steady rhythm of chores already begun. Samuel was outside, splitting wood, his silhouette framed against the gold-gray horizon. For a moment she watched from the window, unsure if she should step out or wait to be called. This was her husband now, and yet he felt like a stranger standing on the edge of her life. She washed her face in cold water and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The air inside the cabin was sharp with morning chill. The stove had burned out during the night. As she fumbled with the tinder, she thought of home, of her mother's warm hearth and her father's quiet sighs before the debts came. That world was gone. This was her new one, and she didn't know the rules yet. When she finally stepped outside, Samuel looked up only briefly. "There's milk to fetch," he said. His voice was low, not unkind, but distant, as though he were speaking to the wind rather than her. He pointed toward the small shed where a lone cow shifted restlessly. Clara obeyed without question. The pail was heavy, the cow stubborn, and her inexperience quickly showed. The milk spilled over her hands and the cow kicked at the bucket. Embarrassed, she bit her lip, expecting Samuel's anger when he came to check on her. But he only sighed and crouched beside her, steadying the animal with a practiced hand. "You'll learn," he said simply. The words were gentle but final, neither praise nor scolding. He showed her how to hold the pail firm, how to calm the cow with soft humming. When the bucket was full, he rose and left her to finish. Clara's heart was oddly light. He hadn't mocked her or raised his voice, yet his silence left her uncertain. Was he being kind or merely indifferent? The day dragged on with endless small labors, chopping wood, scrubbing clothes, patching holes in the walls. The farmhouse was old, the land worn and weary. Samuel worked from dawn to dusk, his back bent, his eyes shadowed. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about the weather or the fields. Never about himself, never about her. At supper, they sat across from each other, the crackling fire the only sound. Clara tried to make conversation, asking about the nearest town, about the crops. His answers came short and clipped. After a while, she stopped asking, yet she noticed things, small, wordless gestures that spoke louder than speech. He left an extra piece of bread on her plate when she'd eaten little. He hung her shawl by the stove so it would be warm in the morning. When her hands blistered from washing, she found a small jar of ointment placed quietly on the table. That night, the silence between them was softer somehow. Samuel lay again on the floor, the blanket pulled up to his chest. Clara stared at the low ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing. She wondered what kind of pain had carved the distance into his voice, what memory made him retreat into solitude. She didn't yet know of the woman whose shadow lingered in every corner of that cabin, the first wife whose absence haunted him still. But in the hush of that cold farmhouse, as the wind sighed through the walls, Clara began to sense something beneath his silence, a gentleness too heavy to name. And though fear still lingered in her chest, it mingled now with curiosity. Samuel Hayes was not the man she'd been warned of. He was harder to understand, neither cruel nor kind, but broken in a way that drew her closer, even as he kept her at arm's length. By early autumn, Clara had learned the rhythm of the farm, the way the rooster's crow signaled the start of another long day, the way the sun sank red behind the fields, leaving the land cold and still. Her hands had grown rough, her body stronger, yet Samuel remained the same, distant, polite, and unreachable. They spoke only when work demanded it. He never raised his voice, never touched her except by accident. At first, she told herself she was grateful. Many women suffered worse fates, husbands who beat or belittled them, who drank away their wages or treated their wives like servants. Samuel did none of those things. But it was the silence that gnawed at her. A wall stood between them, invisible yet unyielding, built from grief or guilt she did not understand. One afternoon, Clara walked the long mile to the creek for water. The air smelled of rain and dying leaves. As she bent to fill her pail, she noticed movement in the tall grass. A small figure, gray-haired and bent, watching her from a distance. "Mrs. Greeley," the woman introduced herself with a nod, shuffling closer. "I live just over the ridge. Haven't seen a new face out here in years." Clara smiled shyly. "I'm Samuel Hayes's wife." At the mention of his name, the old woman's expression changed. A flicker of pity, or perhaps sorrow. "Ah," she said softly. So he finally took another. Clara frowned. "Another?" Mrs. Greeley hesitated, then sighed. "His first wife, Mary, she died. Childbirth took her. Terrible thing." He buried her himself. "Never spoke a word to no one for months after?" The woman lowered her voice. "Some say he blamed himself. Others say he lost his faith the day she passed. Haven't seen him smile since. The wind picked up, tugging at Clara's skirt. Her heart ached at the image. A man alone in the cold earth, digging a grave for his wife and child. She wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Greeley only gave her a sad nod. "You mind your heart, dear. He carries ghosts that don't rest easy." All the way back to the farmhouse, the woman's words echoed in Clara's mind. Ghosts that don't rest easy. When Samuel came in for supper, covered in dust and sweat, she watched him differently. The tiredness in his eyes, the way his hand lingered on the door frame before stepping inside, everything suddenly made sense. He was a man carved hollow by loss. As they ate in silence, Clara found herself blurting the question she'd promised not to ask. "Who was Mary?" Samuel froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Don't speak her name again." His tone wasn't cruel. It was weary, like a door closing forever. Clara wanted to apologize, but he rose from the table and stepped outside, disappearing into the night. She sat there long after the fire burned low, staring at his empty chair. In that moment, pity welled up inside her, followed by something else, something tender and uncertain. This man hadn't bought her for pleasure or pride. He'd brought her here because he didn't know how to live alone. Later that night, she saw him sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. His face was still, his eyes distant. For a moment, she thought of joining him, of saying something kind. But she stopped herself. He was a man bound by memory, and she, a stranger stepping into another woman's shadow. Still, as she lay in bed, she whispered into the dark. "I'm sorry for her." Samuel didn't answer. But through the wall, she thought she heard his quiet, broken sigh, a sound that wasn't anger, but grief. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara understood Samuel's silence wasn't made of cruelty. It was made of sorrow too deep for words. The air that day felt strange, heavy, restless, like the land itself was holding its breath. Clouds gathered thick over the hills, bruised and swollen with rain. Clara felt the shift before the first rumble of thunder rolled across the fields. She had been hanging clothes on the line when the wind picked up, snatching one of Samuel's shirts and sending it tumbling across the yard. "Storm's coming fast," Samuel called from the barn, his voice barely carrying over the rising gusts. "Get inside, Clara." But she lingered, gathering the last of the laundry, refusing to leave her work unfinished. Ever since she'd arrived, she'd learned to fill her days with small tasks, anything to keep from thinking too much. Yet as the wind grew wild, whipping dust into her face, she saw Samuel rushing to secure the barn doors. His urgency frightened her. By the time she reached the porch, fat drops of rain were pelting the ground. The sky cracked open with lightning so bright it split the world in two. A heartbeat later, a deafening boom followed, and then the smell of smoke. Clara turned and gasped. The barn, their only barn, was on fire. Flames licked up the wooden beams, feeding hungrily on the dry hay inside. The horses screamed, trapped. Without thinking, she ran toward the blaze. "Clara!" Samuel's shout tore through the storm, but she didn't stop. The heat hit her like a wall as she pulled at the latch. Sparks stung her arms. Her dress caught with a small flame she beat out with her sleeve. She managed to open the door just enough for one horse to bolt free before Samuel reached her, grabbing her shoulders. "Are you mad?" he roared, his first real shout since she'd known him. "You'll burn alive." "They'll die," she cried, trying to twist free. In one swift motion, he dragged her back from the flames, shielding her with his own body as part of the roof collapsed. The fire roared higher, consuming the barn entirely. Samuel fell to his knees in the mud, his arms still around her, as they watched everything they'd worked for, hay, tools, livestock, turn to ash. Rain poured down in sheets now, but it was too late. The barn was gone. Clara looked at him then, really looked, at the soot on his face, the raw grief twisting his features. For the first time, his silence shattered. He buried his face in his hands and whispered, "I can't lose it all again." She realized with a pang that he wasn't talking about the barn. He was talking about his wife, his child, his hope. Clara knelt beside him, her hands trembling. The storm blurred everything, rain, smoke, tears. Without a word, she reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. They stayed like that, two broken souls huddled in the mud, bound not by duty, but by shared loss. When the fire finally died, only embers remained, glowing faintly like dying stars. Samuel stood and looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse. "You shouldn't have run into that fire. You could have died. So could you," she replied softly. Their eyes met, really met, for the first time. In that silence, something fragile and human passed between them, something neither dared to name. Later, when they returned to the cabin, Samuel set a blanket around her shoulders and stoked the fire until the chill faded. For the first time, he didn't sleep on the floor. Instead, he sat beside the hearth all night, watching the flames in her face by turns, as if guarding her from the ghosts that haunted him. Clara, half asleep, felt warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm had taken their barn, but it had given her something far rarer, a glimpse of the man behind the silence and the fragile beginnings of trust. The morning after the fire rose gray and quiet, the kind of silence that follows tragedy. The barn was nothing but blackened beams and smoldering ash, its outline like a wound against the horizon. Clara stood by the ruins, the hem of her dress still damp from the night's storm, her heart heavy with guilt. She felt responsible somehow. If she hadn't run into the fire, if she'd been wiser, maybe something could have been saved. Samuel joined her without a word, his hat pulled low, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He didn't look at her at first. Together they surveyed what was left. The tools melted into twisted iron, the hay gone, the small pen where the horses once stood now empty. The loss was staggering. Yet when he finally turned toward her, his expression wasn't anger. It was weary acceptance. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. Clara blinked. "We?" His lips curved, just barely. "You're part of this place now, aren't you?" For the first time, the word we carried warmth. Something unspoken settled between them, fragile but real. They began that very morning, side by side, clearing the rubble. Samuel showed her how to use a hammer, how to lift beams without splintering them. His hands guided hers, not in possession but in patience. "You've got strength," he said once as she struggled to pull a board loose. She laughed softly, wiping soot from her cheek. "Not enough to lift a barn." His eyes softened. "No one builds a barn alone." It was the first time she'd heard humor in his voice. A small thing, but to Clara it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Days passed like that, one blending into the next. Together they worked, ate and rested, their movements falling into rhythm. Samuel stopped avoiding her gaze. Sometimes she even caught him watching her with quiet curiosity. When she burned her hand on a nail, he took her fingers gently in his rough palms and wrapped the wound in clean cloth. "You'll scar," he murmured. "I don't mind scars," she said. "They mean I tried." He looked at her for a long time then, as though seeing her anew. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they sat by the half-built fence, sharing a piece of bread and stew. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer cold but companionable. Clara found herself smiling without realizing it. "You miss her, don't you?" she asked quietly. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't pull away this time. "Every day," he admitted. "But the missing? It doesn't hurt the same as before." She nodded, understanding. "Maybe it's because you're not alone anymore." He met her eyes then, something unguarded flickering there. Maybe. That night, for the first time, Samuel didn't take the floor. Instead, he sat in the chair beside the window, keeping watch as she drifted to sleep. Outside, the crickets sang softly, the world slowly healing after the storm. When Clara awoke before dawn, she found him already outside, repairing the broken corral. She made coffee, weak and watery, but it was all they had, and carried it out to him. The look he gave her when she handed him the mug made her heart stumble. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled. "For what?" "For staying," he replied. In that moment, Clara understood that something precious had begun to grow, not from wealth or desire, but from shared hardship. Love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it appeared quietly, like the first shoots of spring after a harsh winter. As the morning light spread over the valley, she stood beside Samuel, their shoulders brushing. The fire had taken much, but in its ashes, something new had begun. A bond forged not by circumstance, but by choice. By late spring, the land had begun to heal. The wheat Samuel planted sprouted green and soft, whispering in the breeze like a promise. The new barn, smaller than the last but sturdy, stood as proof of what two determined hands could build together. Life had settled into rhythm, early mornings, long hours, and quiet suppers that no longer felt like silence, but something close to peace. When Samuel told Clara they were going to town for market day, she was both excited and nervous. It would be her first time among people since her marriage. The first time she would step into the world not as her father's daughter but as a wife. She rose early that morning, combed her hair and put on the one decent dress she owned, a faded blue cotton gown mended at the sleeves. Samuel loaded the wagon with sacks of grain, a few jugs of milk, and Clara's small bundle of eggs and bread she'd baked to sell. As he helped her climb aboard, she noticed how his hand lingered briefly at her elbow, steady and sure. The town bustled with life, vendors shouting, wagons creaking, children darting between stalls. Clara's heart raced at the noise and color. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed hearing laughter. Yet as they walked, she felt the curious eyes of strangers follow them. "Is that Samuel Hayes?" one man muttered. "Didn't think he'd ever take another wife." "She's just a girl," whispered another. "Poor thing." Clara kept her gaze low, pretending not to hear. Samuel said nothing, his expression unreadable. But his hand tightened around the rope he carried, his jaw set hard. They set up their small stand near the end of the market road. Clara sold bread and eggs while Samuel traded grain for tools and seed. To her surprise, people bought eagerly, drawn to the shy young woman with kind eyes. Some smiled, some offered gossip, and for the first time in months, Clara felt seen, not as a burden or a bargain, but as herself. Around midday, a wealthy merchant approached their stand. He was a large man in a clean vest, his fingers glittering with rings. He eyed Clara with a smirk before turning to Samuel. "You've done well for yourself," the merchant said. "Pretty little thing like her must fetch a high price." Clara froze, unsure she'd heard right. The man chuckled. "If you ever find yourself short on coin, I'd pay double what she cost you. She'd make a fine housemaid or something finer." Before Clara could react, Samuel moved. In one swift motion, he stepped between them, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You'll keep your money and your tongue, Weston," the merchant's smirk faltered. "No harm meant, Hayes, just jesting." Samuel's eyes darkened. "No one jokes about buying her." "Not again." He grabbed Clara's hand and walked away, leaving their wares behind. The market noise blurred around them as he led her to the wagon. He didn't speak until they were out of town, the horses' hooves clattering on the road. "I shouldn't have brought you there," he muttered, his voice thick. "Those men—" He broke off, shaking his head. Clara looked at their joined hands, his rough, hers small and trembling. "You stood up for me," she said softly. "No one's ever done that before." He turned to her, surprise flickering across his features. "You shouldn't have needed it." "But I did," she whispered. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence now, charged, alive. When they reached the farm, Samuel helped her down from the wagon and hesitated before letting go of her hand. "No one buys you again," he said quietly, almost to himself. Clara's eyes filled, not with sorrow but something deeper. "I know," she replied, "because I'm not for sale anymore." That night, as they shared supper by the fire, the air between them felt changed, warmer, braver. Clara had gone to town as a stranger beside her husband. She returned home as his equal. Summer came slow that year, hot and golden, draping the valley in a quiet peace Clara had never known before. The fields shimmered with ripening grain, the air thick with the hum of bees. For the first time since her marriage, the farm felt like home. Clara woke each morning not with dread, but with purpose. She cooked, tended the garden, and sang softly as she worked, her voice carrying across the yard. Sometimes Samuel would pause in his chores just to listen. He didn't say it aloud, but her presence had changed everything, turned silence into comfort, labor into life. One afternoon, as the sun burned high, a dust-covered rider approached the farmhouse. Clara was shelling peas on the porch when she heard the distant clatter of hooves. Samuel stepped out, shading his eyes, his body tense until the rider drew close. "A postman from town." "Letter for Mrs. Hayes," the man said. Handing over an envelope worn and crumpled from travel, Clara blinked in surprise. No one had ever written to her before. The handwriting was shaky but familiar, the looping scrawl of her father. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Clara, if this reaches you, I may already be gone. My body's failing, and the doctor says I won't see another harvest. I've made my peace with the Lord, but not with what I did to you. I sold my daughter to pay my debts. I see that now as my greatest sin. If you can, come home, just once, so I can ask your forgiveness face to face." The letter ended abruptly, as if he'd grown too weak to finish. Clara's throat tightened. Her father had been many things, stern, flawed, desperate, but he was still the man who once lifted her onto his shoulders to watch the sun rise. She folded the letter with trembling fingers, tears blurring her vision. Samuel watched her quietly. "Bad news?" "It's my father," she whispered. "He's dying. He wants me to come." Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze lowering. "Then you should go." Her heart sank at his tone, gentle but distant again. "You'll come with me?" she asked. He hesitated. "It's not my place." Clara shook her head. "You're my husband." "Of course it is." He met her eyes then, and she saw the struggle there. "You don't owe me anything, Clara," he said softly. "I brought you here because I thought I was saving you. But you've done the saving. You don't need to stay because of duty." His words hit harder than she expected. For months she had wondered what she meant to him. Pity, obligation, perhaps companionship. Now she realized the truth. Samuel had been holding back not out of indifference, but out of love, love too afraid to take what it hadn't earned. She folded the letter tightly in her fist. "I'll go," she said, "but not because I want to leave you." That night she packed a small satchel, her movements slow and deliberate. Samuel helped her hitch the wagon at dawn. The air was cool, the sky painted with the soft blush of morning. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, as she climbed into the seat, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. A small, tender gesture that broke something open inside her. "Be safe," he murmured. "And tell him he raised a brave daughter." Clara wanted to say 1,000 things, to thank him, to promise she'd return, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she placed her hand over his. "I'll come back," she whispered. "I promise." As the wagon rolled away, the farm receded behind her like a dream she didn't want to wake from. The letter had called her home, but her heart already knew the truth. Home was no longer where she'd come from. It was the man watching her disappear down the long, dusty road. The road home was long and lined with memories Clara thought she had left behind forever. The closer she came to her old village, the smaller she felt, like the frightened girl who'd been sold for a pouch of coins and a promise. Yet now she wasn't that girl anymore. The months with Samuel had changed her in quiet, steady ways. She had learned to work, to endure, and, most of all, to hope. They arrived 2 days later at her father's cottage. The roof sagged, the windows were broken, and the garden had long since turned to weeds. Inside, the air smelled of sickness and old regrets. Her father lay on a narrow bed, his face pale as parchment. When his eyes opened and found her standing in the doorway, tears filled them instantly. "Clara," he rasped, reaching out a trembling hand. She knelt beside him, the letter clutched in her palm. For a long moment she couldn't speak. All her life she'd imagined this man as unyielding, harsh as the land he tilled. But now he looked small, fragile, undone by his own guilt. "I didn't think you'd come," he whispered. "After what I did." "I came," she said softly, taking his hand. "You're still my father." He closed his eyes and a faint smile touched his lips. "I was wrong, Clara. I thought I was saving myself, but I was only damning my soul." "You deserved better." She wanted to tell him she'd found better, that the man he sold her to had given her something no amount of money could buy, dignity. But before she could, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there stood Samuel. He had followed her. For a moment, she just stared. His clothes were dusted with travel, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said quietly, setting down his hat. Clara rose to her feet, heart pounding. "You said it wasn't your place." He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "It wasn't, but it is now," her father coughed weakly. "You're the farmer," he said, studying Samuel. "The one I sold her to." Samuel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes, sir. And did you treat her well?" Samuel's answer came low but steady. "I tried. I didn't buy her to own her. I bought her to protect her from the man who offered double my price that day." He glanced at Clara then, his eyes soft. "I couldn't stand by and let her fall into hands that would hurt her." "That's the truth." Clara's breath caught. She remembered that day. The way her father couldn't meet her eyes. The way the coins clinked in the pouch. She'd believed Samuel had been part of the same cruelty, but now she saw him differently. He hadn't been her captor. He had been her shield. Her father's eyes glistened. Then she was safe after all. "She saved me too," Samuel said quietly. "I thought my life was over. I didn't think I'd ever feel again. But she brought light back to my home." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the floorboards and the wind sighing through the broken window. Clara felt tears blur her vision. Her father turned to her, his voice barely a whisper. "Then I can go in peace." She pressed his hand to her lips. "You're forgiven," she whispered. "You were lost, but I found kindness in the place you sent me." That night, as her father slipped quietly into death, Clara sat beside him with Samuel's arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke. There were no words for the strange grace that had brought them all to this ending. Pain, loss, forgiveness, love, all tangled together like roots beneath the soil. When dawn broke, Clara buried her father beside her mother beneath the old elm tree. The earth was soft from last night's rain. As she stood there, Samuel took her hand and said gently, "It's time to go home." She looked up at him through her tears. "I am home," she said, and this time she meant it. The journey back to the farm felt different this time. When Clara had first left, she carried uncertainty, grief, and the ache of unfinished forgiveness. Now, with her father laid to rest and her heart lighter than it had been in years, she carried something new: peace. Samuel drove the wagon in silence beside her, his hands steady on the reins. The road stretched wide and golden before them, the air cool with early autumn. Neither spoke for a long while. There was comfort in the quiet, a sense that words were no longer needed to fill the spaces between them. At one point, Clara turned to look at him. The morning sun caught in his hair, and for the first time she saw not the solemn, weary farmer she had once feared, but a man of quiet strength, someone who had given her freedom without asking for anything in return. She realized then that love didn't always arrive with grand gestures or passionate words. Sometimes it came slowly, through gentleness, through shared silences, through the simple act of staying. They reached the farm by evening. The land looked just as they had left it, the wooden fences leaning under the weight of time, the small barn standing proud against the fading sky. But to Clara, everything seemed softer now, as if the world itself had forgiven her for her past. When they stepped down from the wagon, Samuel paused. "You don't have to stay here," he said quietly. "You could go to town, start over." "You've done more for me than I ever deserved." Clara turned to face him, her eyes bright in the sunset. "Why do you think I'd want to leave?" He hesitated, unsure. Because I was never what you asked for. You were given to me, not by choice. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. You were the only one who ever gave me a choice, Samuel. That's why I stayed. The words seemed to catch him off guard. He looked down as though struggling to believe her. You deserve more than a poor farmer with worn hands and an old heart, he murmured. She stepped closer then, so near he could see the softness in her gaze. I don't want more, she said simply. I want you. For a long time, neither moved. The evening breeze stirred the wheat fields around them, whispering through the stalks like an old hymn. Then Samuel reached for her hand, tentatively, as if afraid she might vanish. And she didn't pull away. His fingers were rough, but his touch was gentle, reverent. That night the farmhouse felt different. The same walls that once felt cold and lonely now glowed with warmth from the fire they built together. Clara prepared supper while Samuel fed the animals, and when he returned, they ate in quiet contentment. No awkward silences, no uncertainty, only a deep, unspoken understanding. Afterward, Samuel brought out his mother's old fiddle from the corner, a relic he hadn't touched since his wife died. I used to play, he said, almost shyly. Will you play for me now? Clara asked. He nodded and began to draw the bow across the strings. The melody was low and haunting, a song of loss and renewal. Clara closed her eyes and listened, her heart full. For the first time since she could remember, she felt safe, completely, utterly safe. When the last note faded, Samuel set the fiddle aside. The fire crackled softly between them. He reached for her hand again, not as a master, not as a man claiming what was his, but as a soul reaching for another. Clara, he said quietly, you've brought life back to this place. To me, she smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And you've given me something I never thought I'd have, she whispered. A home that doesn't hurt. Outside, the moon rose over the fields, silvering the land they had built together. The wind carried the faint sound of crickets and the promise of another day. For the first time, Clara knew, without doubt or fear, that this was where she belonged. Not as the girl who had been sold, but as the woman who had finally been chosen. Winter came softly that year. The first snow fell like feathers across the fields, blanketing the farm in white silence. Inside the small farmhouse, the fire crackled warmly, and Clara stood by the window watching the flakes drift past the glass. It had been nearly a year since she first arrived here, frightened, uncertain, barely 19, and in that time, her world had changed in ways she could never have imagined. The woman who looked back at her reflection in the frosted glass was no longer the timid girl who'd been sold into marriage. Her hands were rough from work, her shoulders strong, her heart no longer burdened by shame. The farm had shaped her, but so had love, quiet and steadfast, like the earth itself. Samuel entered the room, his steps slow, his smile easy. He carried 2 mugs of warm cider and handed one to her. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing out the window. "Best stay close to the fire tonight." She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup. "I used to dread winters," she admitted softly. "They always felt like endings." He smiled faintly. "Funny thing about winters, they always lead to spring." They sat together before the hearth, the light flickering across their faces. The years of loneliness in Samuel's eyes had softened, replaced by something calm and certain. Clara had become the warmth he never thought he'd feel again. And in him, she'd found safety, a kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. As the wind howled outside, Clara thought of the road that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, the helplessness. Every step had led to this moment. She turned to Samuel, studying the lines around his eyes, the quiet strength in his face. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Buying me?" He looked at her, startled by the question. Then slowly he shook his head. "No," he said. "I regret that you had to be bought, but not that you came." She smiled at that, sad and tender all at once. "I used to think I was cursed," she whispered, "that no one would ever want me for who I was. But you never treated me like something to be owned." Samuel's voice was low. You were never mine to own, Clara. You were only mine to care for, if you'd let me. Tears welled in her eyes. And I do, she said simply. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle as falling snow. Then that's enough, he murmured. That's more than I ever hoped for. The fire burned low, casting golden light across the room. Outside, the world was still, just the whisper of wind against the window panes. For the first time in years, Clara felt utterly content. She leaned her head on Samuel's shoulder, their hands intertwined, their breaths matching the rhythm of the crackling flames. Time passed quietly after that. The snow deepened, the days grew shorter, and life continued its steady rhythm. They worked the land together when spring returned, sowing seeds side by side, tending calves, mending fences. Each small act became a shared vow, a promise renewed in the turning of the seasons. Sometimes in the evenings, Samuel would bring out his fiddle and play by the fire. Clara would hum along, her voice soft and sure. The farmhouse would glow with warmth, not just from the fire, but from the life they'd built together, a home grown from hardship and healed by kindness. One morning, as they stood watching the sunrise over the fields, Clara turned to him and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How something broken can still grow." Samuel smiled. "It's the only way things grow," he said, "through the breaking." She took his hand, the sunlight catching her gold wedding band, no longer a symbol of trade, but of choice. Together they looked out at the land that had once been barren and now stretched green and alive before them. And in that quiet moment, Clara realized that the promise of tomorrow wasn't something to be feared. It was something they had already begun to build, one dawn, one seed, one act of love at a time.